everybody? Pat with Infinite Fitness here, coming at you guys with another video today. Today's video is going to be on training to failure. Should you do it? When should you do it? Is it beneficial? Is it beneficial for everybody? There's a lot of questions on this. Now, there are a lot of myths around training to failure and if and when you need to do it. So in today's video, we are going to talk about the pros and cons. Let's get started. So, I'm sure some of you have heard the myth. Gotta train to failure, bro. Can't grow otherwise, bro. That is actually not the truth. Training to failure can be very beneficial, but training to failure also has a lot of costs associated with it. So, training all the way to failure can be beneficial for maximal muscle growth. However, training to failure is very taxing on the body. So if you're actually taking a certain lift to failure, there's always going to be a cost associated with that action. Every exercise is going to be a little different in terms of how much it costs you to train to failure. If you take a set of heavy back squats all the way to failure, it's going to affect you a lot differently than if you take a set of bicep curls to failure. So training below failure has actually been shown to be more beneficial for maximal strength gains. So if you are a strength athlete, training to failure regularly should probably not be something that's associated with your program. And if you are a physique athlete or someone looking to build the most amount of muscle you can train to failure. You just want to be very wise with how you do it. So now that we've kind of covered the overview of training to failure, let's talk about the pros and cons. So now that we have an idea of the overview of training to failure and how it can be beneficial but can also not be beneficial, let's talk about the pros and cons in different situations. So first, let's cover the pros. One of the pros of using training to failure is that it raises the overall intensity of a particular program or a particular muscle group. So if I have a client that's struggling to grow their chest, I might prescribe them 1 to 2 sets per week of training all the way to failure to really stimulate muscle growth. Okay, so training to failure is one of the things that you can do to raise the overall intensity of a program. Now, especially if I have a particular client that tends to stop their sets shy of failure, this can also be really good because it will teach them how to really drive effort, push themselves, and probably tap into some new heights with their training. The second thing is training to failure can be very beneficial for smaller movements. So, for example, going back to what I said about 2 minutes ago in this video, the cost of every exercise when training to failure is different. Training to failure on a set of back squats is going to have a much different effect than training to failure on a set of bicep curls. So if I have someone that has a lagging muscle group like arms or calves or something like that, and I prescribe them a single joint movement like bicep curls, they can take that exercise to failure or relatively close to failure on most of their sets and not pay a huge price for it. So it can be very beneficial to raise the overall intensity and allow them to grow some new muscle mass. A third pro to training to failure is it can be very effective before a planned break or deload week. So for example, if I have an athlete or a client that I want to really test where they're at, I might prescribe them a set very close to failure or at failure and really push them before a planned break week or easy week or something like that. That way, even though the exercise is very taxing, they will have a couple of weeks to recover from it because they have a planned lighter week ahead of them. Okay? So there clearly are some pros to training to failure. It's not all bad by any means. But let's also talk about the cons so we can weigh the cost-benefit analysis here. One of the cons of training to failure is it is very taxing on the central nervous system, especially on big movements. So for example, if I had a client that was very strong and I told them to take a heavy set of their back squats all the way to failure, it might take them 2 to 3 weeks to fully recover from that before their strength levels come back up to baseline. And odds are the rest of their training sessions for either that particular week or that week and the following are going to be negatively affected by that set all the way to failure. This becomes more and more taxing the stronger that you get because athletes learn how to push themselves harder, they're handling heavier weights, all those other things. So that is definitely a big con when training to failure. The second thing is it can hinder recovery between sessions. So going back to my earlier example of bicep curls, especially if you are a physique athlete or somebody that's looking to build a great body, one of the best ways to maximize your muscle growth is to hit each muscle group multiple times per week that you are trying to grow. So the research has shown that hitting muscle groups at least twice per week is more beneficial than hitting them once per week, especially for more advanced trainings. Let's say that I have a client that has 2 arm sessions in a given week. If I have them take their first arm session all the way to failure on several exercises, odds are it is going to negatively affect the second arm session in the week. So if I'm going to prescribe training to failure, it has to be a very calculated decision because I don't want to affect this trainee's session throughout the rest of the week just to get a little bit more intensity in one day. So again, going back to the cost-benefit analysis, maybe it feels really good and challenging to push yourself to failure on certain movements, but if you are getting negatively affected from that later on in the week, it's not worth it. The last con of training to failure is that training to failure is not as beneficial for strength athletes. So the research has shown that training below failure is much more beneficial long-term for athletes interested in maximal strength. So if I had a client that said, hey, I want to get my 1 rep max back squat to be as heavy as possible, I would not prescribe them a lot of failure training, maybe a little bit here and there to raise the intensity or help them build some muscle mass, but it would be very few and far between because it is going to negatively impact their overall strength levels. So now that we have the pros and the cons to training to failure, let's put it all together and talk about what it means. So where do we go from here? Training to failure can be useful, but use it wisely in your training. Okay? If you're finding that you are training to failure all the time or on most of your exercises, you're probably doing a little bit too much and that it's probably not as beneficial as you think it is. Different movements require different costs and accrue different levels of fatigue. Again, when looking at the hierarchy of your training, if you're hitting legs twice a week and you have your first exercise right out the gate that is your biggest movement of the week and you take all 4 of your sets or 5 of your sets to failure, odds are the rest of your training is going to be negatively impacted throughout the rest of the week. So if you are going to train to failure, pick the right movements at the right times and utilize them in the right dosage to get the best effect, okay? Last point, it should not make up the bulk of your training. If you're training to failure all the time, multiple days per week, on multiple sets, odds are your training is suffering and you probably do not even know it. This also goes for strength athletes. If you are constantly failing reps, odds are you are doing too much and negatively affecting your training. So if you do decide to use training to failure, a good rule of thumb is maybe use it for 1 to 2 sets per muscle group per week tops. Again, this is in a, that's going to be your maximal level. You don't even need to take every single muscle group to failure every single week. Most weeks you don't even need to train to failure at all. Again, based on the research, training shy of failure for strength is more beneficial and has been shown to be just as beneficial for maximal muscle group growth over the long term. So, that is our video for today. I hope you learned something. If you did, please subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, anything like that. If you would like, feel free to follow me on Instagram. My handle is @pat_IF personal training. Hope you guys enjoyed this and learned something, and as always, stay strong.